Sew a tank dress with me today. This is the Jolene dress, a free pattern from Tiana's Closet. This dress features an empire waist, front gathers, and arm and neckline bindings. If you have not sewn a V-neckline before, this is a great pattern to start with, and I'll be demonstrating the full process. Now let's sew a pretty fit and flare knit dress. Here is my front bodice piece, and I'm going to sew basting stitches from notch to notch on both sides of the bottom edge of the bodice. Make sure to leave thread tails on both ends so that you have threads to pull for gathering. Place that front bodice piece right sides together with the front skirt and pin in the center and the sides. Then you can pull your basting stitches so that the front bodice fits in the area between the notches. Once those sections fit, pin in place. Then sew the top front piece to the front skirt with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to be using a walking foot and a narrow zigzag stitch. You can choose to finish the raw edges of that seam if you prefer. Since the material I'm working with does not fray, I'm going to leave these edges raw. And I've pressed my seam allowances downward. Now I'll place my front and back dress pieces right sides together. And I'll pin both of my side seams matching the notches. Now that I have both of my side seams pinned, from the underarm to the bottom of the dress, I'm also going to pin the shoulder seams. Sew each of these seams with your preferred stretch stitch and finish the seams if you like. Here is the front of the garment with the right side facing me. And here is the V at the center of my front bodice. Before I start applying the binding, I'm going to do some stay stitching around that V with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to start my stay stitching about 1 inch away from the V on one side, pivot at the bottom of the V, and end 1 inch away from the V on the opposite side. Now that the bottom of the V has been stay stitched, I'm going to use sharp scissors to clip to the stitching line but not beyond. I'm going to fold my neckline binding right sides together, and I'm going to sew the short ends with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then press the seam open. Now I'll use a pin to mark the center back and the center front of my neckband. My seam will indicate the center back. I'll place the neckband right sides together with the neckline, starting to pin at the center back. And making sure the neckband is not twisted, I'll also pin at the center front. I'm going to sew the binding to the neckline as I would for a regular circular neckband. And the clipping that we made at the center V will allow the fabric to open up flat as we sew that binding straight across right along our stay stitching. So I'll be sewing this neckband with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we'll be stretching that neckband slightly as we go, being careful not to stretch the main body material. Here is my garment right side facing me with the neckband attached, and I have my neckband pressed up and away from the garment. Now I'm going to fold my garment along the center front, so that the right sides are together as well as the right sides of the neckband. So now I'm looking at the garment inside out, and here is my center front seam, and my neckline binding is also right sides together right along that center front area. And you can see that the neckline binding juts out away from the center front. I'm going to pin this neckline binding right sides together as it's laid, And I'm going to draw a straight line onto the binding only, not the seam allowance, that falls in line with the center front. Now with the seam allowance out of the way, I'll sew from the seam line to the top of the binding, right along the line that I've drawn. So here's the triangle that we just created in the binding, and I'm going to trim that seam allowance to about 1/8 of an inch and press that seam open. Now we have a V shape in the binding to mimic the center front. I'm going to turn the binding now entirely to the inside along the main seam line and pin in place. And I'm going to top stitch all the way around with about a 3/8 inch seam allowance pivoting around that center V. Now that that's sewn, I'll trim any excess binding beyond my stitching. Then give that neckline a really good press. You can choose to apply your armhole bindings in the exact same way as we did for the front neckline, with the exception of the bottom V. I'm choosing to press both of my armbands wrong sides together. Now that both of my bindings are pressed in half, I'll open up the fold just for a moment and place the pieces right sides together along the short edge. Sew the short edges with the 1/4 inch seam allowance and then fold them back in half the way they were. Now I'm going to quarter the bindings, and I've also quartered both of my armholes. Now I'll place the armhole binding right sides together with each armhole, matching the quarter points and pinning in place, aligning the raw edges. Repeating for both bindings. Now you can use your preferred stretch stitch or your serger to sew the band to the armhole all the way around, using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowances toward the garment. Then we can top stitch with about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around each armhole using your preferred stretch stitch. You could also use your cover stitch or a twin needle. Here is the bottom of my dress, and I've already pressed the hem to the wrong side by 1 inch. The hem allowance for the bottom of the dress according to the pattern is 3/8 of an inch, but I have chosen to create a little bit deeper of a hem. Now I'm going to edge stitch close to the raw inner edge all the way around using a stretch stitch. You can also use a cover stitch machine or your twin needle. And now your dress is complete. Thanks for watching this sew along. Here's the final result. I've sewn an extra small here and made no changes to the pattern. This was a very quick sew. The most time-consuming element was the V neckline, but it's worth it. Make sure you subscribe for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.